$20 billion, seized in 7 countries on the same morning, and not one depositor saw it coming. In 1972, a Pakistani financier named Agha Hassan Abedi walked into the banking world with a vision. He wanted to build the first bank of the developing world, a financial institution that would serve the nations that Western banks had largely ignored. He called it the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. Within a decade, it operated in 78 countries, held branches on 6 continents, and claimed assets north of $20 billion. Politicians praised it. Regulators admired it. Ordinary people in 69 countries trusted it with their savings. They were trusting a criminal enterprise. Here is how it worked, and it's worth understanding, because the mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. BCCI held its books in 2 different jurisdictions, Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, and neither regulator could see the full picture. Luxembourg saw one set of numbers, the Caymans saw another. Nobody saw both at once. That structural blind spot wasn't an accident. It was the architecture. While legitimate customers deposited money in London, Abu Dhabi, and Karachi, the bank was simultaneously moving funds for Manuel Noriega in Panama, allegedly for the Medellin cartel in Colombia, and for intelligence services, whose names have never been fully declassified. The loans on the books were often fictitious. The assets were inflated. The profits shown to auditors were, in some cases, manufactured. Abedi understood something that most fraudsters miss. Scale is its own camouflage. A small crooked bank gets examined. A bank with 78 country offices, 14,000 employees, and connections to heads of state becomes, in the eyes of regulators, too complex to be simply criminal. The assumption was that an institution this large must be, at some level, legitimate. That assumption was the bank's greatest asset. But the auditors missed one thread. Price Waterhouse, engaged by the Bank of England to review BCCI operations in 1990, began pulling at it. What they found beneath the respectable surface was a structure they had rarely encountered. Loans had been made to nominees, front people, to purchase shares in the bank itself, creating the illusion of outside investment. A portfolio called the BCCI Treasury was allegedly being used to cover trading losses, so they never appeared in the main accounts. The Black Network, an internal unit described in later U.S. Senate testimony, allegedly facilitated arms deals, bribery, and the movement of funds for clients whose identities the bank had strong reasons to protect. Price Waterhouse issued a private report to the Bank of England in the spring of 1991, using a phrase that became infamous in banking circles. They called it a criminal enterprise. What followed was a coordination exercise without precedent in financial history. Regulators in the United States, the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, Spain, France, and several other jurisdictions agreed to move simultaneously. If any single country acted first, capital would flee to the others overnight. The operation required that every door close at the same moment. July 5, 1991. It was a Saturday. Regulators in 7 countries seized BCCI assets in a single coordinated action before the markets opened on Monday. In London, the Bank of England shuttered the branches. In New York, prosecutors had already been building their case for 2 years through the Manhattan District Attorney's Office under Robert Morgenthau, whose investigators had traced hundreds of millions through a labyrinth of shell entities. In Abu Dhabi, where the majority of shareholders were based, the government moved to take control. In Luxembourg, the holding company was placed in provisional liquidation. Depositors arrived at branches on Monday morning and found the doors locked. In Britain alone, Tens of thousands of account holders, many of them from South Asian communities, who had trusted BCCI precisely because it presented itself as their bank, found they couldn't access their money. Some had their life savings inside. A grocery store owner in Birmingham, a taxi driver in Bradford, a family in Lahore who had sent remittances home through BCCI for years. All of them, on that Monday morning, had the same question: where is our money? The answer was grim. Of the $20 billion in claimed assets, investigators ultimately concluded that somewhere between 5 and 10 billion couldn't be fully accounted for. It had moved through nominee accounts, fictitious loans, and offshore vehicles at a velocity that made tracing it a decade-long project for liquidators who are still, in some form, working through the wreckage today. In the United States, BCCI pleaded guilty to racketeering charges and forfeited roughly $550 million, a fraction of what had moved through the system. In Abu Dhabi, the bank was convicted in absentia on fraud charges. Clark Clifford, one of the most decorated Washington insiders of the 20th century, a former U.S. Secretary of Defense and advisor to 4 presidents, was indicted in 1992 for his role as chairman of a Washington bank that BCCI allegedly controlled secretly. Clifford, then 85 years old and in poor health, was never tried. He died in 1998, the indictment unresolved. In the United Kingdom, a public inquiry led by Lord Bingham, later a senior law lord, concluded in 1992 that the Bank of England had been too slow, too deferential, and insufficiently skeptical in its oversight of BCCI. The bank had received warnings from the U.S. Federal Reserve as early as 1985. It had received intelligence suggesting criminal activity years before the closure. Bingham stopped short of finding the Bank of England negligent in a legal sense, but the report was a detailed accounting of institutional failure. The people who were supposed to be watching were watching the wrong things. Liquidators recovered approximately 30 cents on every dollar owed to creditors. For depositors at the bottom of the priority list, the recovery was considerably less. For some, nothing came back at all. The communities that had trusted BCCI most completely, lower-income immigrant depositors who had fewer alternative banking options and who had been actively targeted by the bank's marketing, bore the sharpest losses. Agha Hassan Abedi suffered a heart attack in 1988. Before the collapse, he was too ill to be extradited. He died in 1995 in Karachi, without serving a day in prison for what American and British authorities described as the largest bank fraud in history to that point. Here is what the BCCI autopsy teaches, and it's the same lesson in every collapse this channel has examined. The architecture of trust is the architecture of the fraud. BCCI wasn't trusted because it had good numbers. It was trusted because it had the appearance of complexity, the endorsement of proximity to power, and the cover of serving a community that wanted to believe. The fraud didn't hide behind the balance sheet. It hid behind the meaning people attached to the institution. When the doors closed on July 5, 1991, $20 billion in claimed assets became, overnight, a question that liquidators are still answering. And in 69 countries, ordinary people learned the hardest version of a lesson that should be taught in schools. The entity holding your money isn't the same thing as your money.